It's late January and it's looking a little sparse in the garden, but that's inevitable. We do still have some food, which is great, some of which might look quite familiar and others not so much. This is mashua, by the way, a tuber crop. And it's also a good time to be thinking about where we're vulnerable, how resilient we really are. We live in a very clever society that provides a lot of things for us at the push of a button or a swipe of a card. But if it came down to it, how resilient do you feel? And this is the whole point of permaculture, is to put some of that resilience back, because nature, if we look at nature, nature is inherently resilient, and our human societies are very clever but perhaps not so resilient these days, and it would be a lot safer and better for us all if we all had some more resilience. So what I'm going to do is to guide you through a permaculture design process over the next few weeks, and we'll be starting by looking at our site, because we can't make decisions about what to do about increasing our food security, for instance, as an example, until we understand more about where we are. And you may live somewhere that you've lived for a very long time and you might know quite a lot about it, but through this process of observation that I'll be taking you through over the next couple of weeks, you'll start to notice things that perhaps you've never noticed before. If you're new to a place, there's going to be lots to discover. We're still learning. We've been here over 4 years now. We're still learning. So let's get started. So what kind of things do we need to know? Well, quite a lot actually. I've got a whole folder of maps here, as you can see, all observations of our site here. And the reason I make lots of maps is that there's lots of information, lots of things to be taking account of. And so rather than put them all on one map where it's really difficult to see anything at all because it's so cluttered, I separate them off into different topics. And so for this particular activity, for this week, I'm going to give you 3 different things to look at. And it starts, yes, it helps to start with a map. And a map doesn't need to be perfect. This is about teaching you how to do permaculture design, not to be a map maker. But in my book and on my online course, I go into much more detail. But for here, there's a couple of different ways of approaching a map. This one here, I've just taken an aerial photograph and just drawn roughly around it. It won't be perfect, it might be slightly off, but it's going to give you a good idea. Or this one where I've just taken some very basic Ordnance Survey map data and again drawn around that. And I'm just using that as a base map, and you can take some measurements and check it. But essentially, for the purposes of this quick design activity, it's fine to have something that's more or less right. It doesn't need to be perfect. Now, what I've also done is to add, the first thing I'm looking at is the structures on the site. And for many of us, we do have things like houses that we live in. And some of those structures are quite solid. So anything made out of stone, for instance, or concrete, those kind of things, I would say are hard structures. So the buildings behind us are definitely hard structures. They're going to be here for a long time, as long as there's reasonable maintenance to the roof and that kind of thing. So I can consider those to be permanent on my map. Obviously in the long term they're not really permanent, but they're permanent in terms of me doing a design around them. And then other structures on the site are softer, so things like this wooden sleeper structure that's housing the pond that we inherited, and there's one here which is really rotten. That's in the later stages of degrading, so eventually these things will rot and disappear. So I like to not put those on my base map, what I call a base map. So the base map has all the things that are not going to move, and we're assuming you're not going to knock your house down or anything like that. So they go on the base map, and then what I'll do is I'll make multiple copies of that base map. So the simplest thing is a photocopier, or if you scan it into a computer you can print it, obviously. And I like to get my base map and then take multiple copies. So for this week you'll need 3 base map copies to do these observations. So having made a note of your main structures and put them on your base map, then I would take the first base map copy and put the soft structures on. So yes, things like wooden boards, so scaffold boards around vegetable beds behind us. There's wooden steps you can see in the background, sleepers and so on. These are things that will degrade over time. I'm not putting them on my base map, I'm putting them on what will eventually be an overlay, but for now it's just a separate map of its own. So with your second map, I'd invite you to go out and look at what we call sectors and microclimates. So in permaculture terms, sectors are the energies coming onto the site from the outside, and the primary ones are the wind and the sun. There are of course things like the rain as well that comes with the wind. But you'll notice, if you're doing this in the winter, when I'm filming this, winter is a good time to be looking at these things, because you'll see behind here there are sunny spots on the walls, but there's also quite a lot of the garden here in the courtyard in the shade, and that's because, of course, the sun is low in the sky. We're at 50 degrees north in Britain, and the buildings to this side are throwing quite a heavy shade on the whole garden. Now, come the spring, that shadow will almost disappear. So this time of year it's really important to be looking at this, because you won't see this, and it's kind of hard to guess unless you've got something like a sun compass, which is a useful tool for identifying. If you go looking at land or houses in the spring, you'll want something like this with you in order to identify, is this going to be shady? What's this like in the winter? Because by the time you're sort of sitting through 3 or 4 months of deep shade, that's a bit depressing, and you start thinking, I wish I hadn't bought this place. I wish I hadn't moved here. So there's a separate video that explains how the sun compass works, so I won't get into that anymore here. So make a note, particularly if you're doing this in the winter, where are the shadows? Where's the shady areas? Where is the sun? So you might have winter sun. If you're doing this any other time of year, it's still useful to be noting where are the sunny corners, where are the spaces that get sun all day, where are the spaces that get morning sun or the afternoon or evening sun. In terms of the wind, where are the sheltered spots, where is it windy? All of these things will relate to not just where you put plants, but also where you might want to sit, for instance, at certain times of year. So get those things down on your map. So wind, where is it windy? Where is it sheltered? Where is it sunny? And of course the wind also can bring the rain. So when you have places that are sheltered from your prevailing winds, they might also be drier. So when it rains, that might also be a rain shadow and not as wet as other areas. So another thing to look out for there. And then with your last map, I'd like you to go and have a look at how water moves across the site. So we've got one here, which will show you in more detail on the screen. What I've been doing with this particular map, well, firstly I've been measuring the areas of the roof. So how much roof area is there? How much does it rain? So you'll need to, unless you already know how much it rains where you are in a year or over certain months, then you'll need to look that up. But that's pretty easy to find out for where you live. And that will allow us to work out how much rain falls onto your roof, which you could be capturing in tanks. As you see, the tanks here are quite small, and that's primarily about the amount of space there is to put the tanks and moving through. But perhaps that's what you have in your garden, a little tank like that, about 200 litres. And when you start measuring how much water falls on your roof, and we start thinking about how much water we use, then that doesn't look very big anymore, but you need to have space for it. So most of our big tanks are on the other side of the house. So measure your roof area, find out what the rainfall is, you multiply one by the other, and we'll put the calculation down below. And the other thing is, you just need to know the runoff coefficient of the roof material. So for things like slate and concrete tile, that's about 85%. So you multiply how much water falls on your roof by how much will run off the roof, because sometimes it soaks into the roof and then re-evaporates. So things like a wooden shingle roof is going to evaporate maybe half of that water back to the sky. It won't ever get into a water container. So that's your rainwater calculation, which brings us on to our water usage. So where does your water come from? Probably mostly out of a tap. And where does it go when you're finished with it? How much water do you use in a day? And some of you may know this, most of us don't. So it's an opportunity to start measuring and finding out how much water you're using. Now, with something like a kettle, there tends to be markings on, so you can kind of work it out. With the shower, you might need a measuring jug to put underneath time, how long it takes to fill, work out how many minutes you shower for, multiply it out, work out how many litres that is. Washing machines, usually there are specifications that say how much they use. But just look at that, how you're using water through the week, and see if you can calculate that. Now, I would recommend definitely keeping a pen and paper in your pocket at all times, as I do, because you never know when you might need to write something down. You notice something, or you had so many cups of tea, or you've washed up and it's this much, and you just add it up. So definitely worth keeping that for noting what you see. Enjoy your observations, and I look forward to seeing you next week for part 2. And in the meantime, if you would like to put in the comments anything that you've noticed or you've learned or particularly surprised by, it would be great to hear from you. Enjoy. See you next week.